October 14, 1943, 27,000 feet over Schweinfurt, Germany, 43 hours. The B-17 flying fortress named Satan's Workshop was dying in peace. Staff Sergeant Mike Arendt, ball turret gunner, watched through his plexiglass sphere as a Messerschmitt BC-8-10 Sovostinen rolled inverted 300 yards out and dove toward the bomber formation with its 20mm cannon already spitting tracer fire. The rounds walked up the fuselage of the B-17 flying 200 feet to Arendt's left, punching through aluminum skin like it was paper, and then the bomber simply came apart. Not exploded, not caught fire, just disintegrated into tumbling fragments of wing and fuselage and human bodies spinning toward the German countryside 5 miles below. Arendt counted 4 parachutes. There should have been 10. The intercom was screaming with voices, pilots calling out fighters, gunners calling out hits, the radio operator yelling that they had lost 2 engines and were falling out of formation. Satan's Workshop shuddered as 30mm cannon shells from a Focke-Wulf 90 tore through the right wing, shredding metal and hydraulic lines and creating a fuel mist that would ignite if anything hot touched it. The German fighter flashed past so close that Arendt could see the pilot's leather helmet and the kill markings painted on the fuselage. 17 bombers. The Luftwaffe pilot had killed 17 American bombers and he was working on number 8. This was Schweinfurt, the second raid on the ball-bearing plants that were critical to German war production, and it was turning into a slaughter that would force the United States Army Air Forces to fundamentally reconsider whether daylight strategic bombing was even possible. The mission had begun 11 hours earlier at Thorpe Abbott's airfield in East Anglia, England, when crews were awakened at 0300 hours for briefing. The men stumbled into the briefing room still half asleep, moving with the mechanical efficiency of people who had done this too many times, who knew that some of them would not be sleeping in these same bunks tonight because they would be dead or captured or bleeding in a German hospital. The intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the mission map and there was a collective groan when the men saw the red ribbon stretching deep into Germany. Schweinfurt again. They had hit Schweinfurt 2 months earlier in August, and that mission had cost the 8th Air Force 36 bombers. Now they were going back, and everyone in the room understood that the Germans would be ready for them, that the defenses would be even heavier than before, and that the mission would be brutal. The briefing officer tried to sound optimistic as he described the target, explaining that the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were critical to German industry, that destroying them would cripple tank production and aircraft production, and virtually everything else that required precision bearings. But the men were not listening to his strategic assessment. They were looking at the map, calculating the distance, the time over target, the route in and out, and they were doing the same grim mathematics that every bomber crew did before every mission. Distance to target, 400 miles. Time in hostile airspace, approximately 5 hours. Fighter escort available for the first 200 miles. Then we are on our own. Probability of surviving the mission, unknown, but historically somewhere between 80 and 90% if you are lucky and 50% if you are not. Do that math over 25 required missions and the survival rate approaches 0, but there was no point dwelling on statistics. You focused on the mission, on doing your job, on bringing your crew home alive, and you tried not to think about the odds. Of the 2091 B-1B-1 V-17s that had taken off from England that morning, 60 would not return. 17 more would be so badly damaged they would never fly again. Over 600 American airmen would be killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The mathematics were crushed. If losses continued at this rate, no bomber crew would survive the required 25 missions. The odds were simple and brutal. You would die before you went home. Staff Sergeant Arendt survived Schweinfurt, but barely. Satan's Workshop made it back to England on 2 engines with hydraulics shot out and half the crew wounded. The pilot, Lieutenant James Macaulay, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for bringing the crippled bomber home, but he was killed 3 weeks later on a mission to Bremen when his aircraft took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire and exploded before anyone could bail out. That was how it went in the fall of 1943. You survived 1 mission, died on the next. You got lucky once, twice, maybe 5 times, and then your luck ran out and you did not come home. The crews understood this with a clarity that headquarters staff never could. Death was not a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. The only question was, when? If this kind of forgotten history makes your heart race like the battlefield itself, subscribe now and join us in reviving the war stories the world tried to forget. But October 14, 1943 was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the culmination of a problem that had been building since the American bombing campaign began in earnest in 1942. And to understand how that crisis was eventually resolved, it is necessary to understand the fundamental strategic problem that the United States Army Air Forces faced in trying to bomb Germany into submission. The problem was range, or more precisely, the lack of it. The American strategic doctrine, developed in the 1930s by theorists, like Billy Mitchell and refined at the Air Corps Tactical School, called for daylight precision bombing of enemy industrial targets using formations of heavy bombers that would defend themselves through massed defensive firepower. The theory was elegant and had been tested extensively in peacetime exercises. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 1350 caliber machine guns mounted in powered turrets in handheld positions that provided overlapping fields of fire covering virtually every approach angle. A single B-17 had defensive gaps, but a formation of 18 or 36 bombers flying in tight formation created a box of interlocking fire that theoretically would make attacking fighters pay a terrible price for every bomber they managed to shoot down. The doctrine assumed that bomber formations properly flown and properly armed could fight their way to the target and back without fighter escort. This assumption would prove to be catastrophically wrong, but in 1942, when the American bombing campaign was just beginning, it seemed reasonable based on the available data. The reality was that German fighters had evolved tactics specifically designed to defeat the defensive firepower of bomber formations. Luftwaffe pilots, many of them veterans with years of combat experience from the Spanish Civil War and the early years of World War II, understood that attacking a bomber formation from behind or from the sides meant flying through concentrated defensive fire that could cripple or destroy a fighter in seconds, so they developed tactics that exploited the weaknesses in bomber defensive fire. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, firing a burst as they closed and then breaking away before the bombers could track them with their guns. Attacks from directly below where the ball turret had limited traverse and where the bomber's wings blocked the line of sight for the waist gunners. Attacks from above and behind, diving in steep angles that minimized exposure time while maximizing the number of bombers that could be hit in a single pass. And most devastating of all, coordinated attacks where multiple fighters would hit a formation simultaneously from different angles, overwhelming the gunners, and ensuring that at least some of the attackers would get through to fire their weapons. A single bus AW-9, or FW-190 with an experienced pilot could kill a BY-117 in seconds if the attack was executed properly. A 4-gun burst from 20mm cannons and 30mm cannons, standard armament on most German fighters by 1943, could tear off a wing, explode fuel tanks, kill the pilot, or destroy engines. And if the first burst did not kill the bomber outright, it would damage it enough that it would fall out of formation, and stragglers were easy prey for German fighters that would finish them off at leisure. The deeper the bombers penetrated into Germany, the worse the situation became, because American escort fighters lacked the range to accompany the bombers all the way to their targets and back. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American escort fighter in 1943, was in many respects a magnificent aircraft. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower with war emergency power, giving the P-47 a top speed of over 40-45 miles per hour at altitude and a rate of climb that was respectable if not spectacular. It was heavily armed with 850 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, giving it firepower that could shred any German fighter with a short burst. And most critically, it was nearly indestructible, with a massive radial engine that could absorb battle damage that would have brought down any liquid-cooled engine, with armor plate protecting the pilot from multiple angles and with a structural strength that allowed it to survive dives at speeds that would tear apart lighter aircraft. P-47 pilots loved the aircraft because they knew it would bring them home even when it was shot full of holes. But the P-47 had one critical weakness. It was heavy, over 17,000 pounds, fully loaded with ammunition. The gap in coverage, what bomber crews grimly called the death zone, was where most of the killing happened. German fighter controllers working from a network of radar stations and ground observation posts would track the American formations from the moment they crossed the channel. They could plot the course and speed of the bomber stream with remarkable accuracy, predict where the American escorts would turn back based on their known range limitations, and vector fighter units into position to intercept once the escorts were gone. The system was efficient and dead. Luftwaffe fighter units based across northern Europe would be alerted when American bombers were detected forming up over England. The units would scramble their aircraft and climb to altitude, positioning themselves along the expected bomber route. When the American escorts turned back, the German fighters would attack wave after wave, coordinated by radio and guided by controllers on the ground who had a comprehensive picture of the battle developing in real time. A typical attack pattern would see German fighters approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, some diving from above, some attacking from the flanks, some making head-on passes, all timed to hit the bomber formation within seconds of each other so that the defensive gunners could not concentrate their fire on any single threat. The effect was chaos. Bombers would would be hit from every direction, taking damage faster than they could react, falling out of formation, spinning toward the ground with engines streaming fire and wings disintegrating under the stress of uncontrolled flight. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, one of the few B-17s to complete 25 missions and return to the United States in 1943, wrote extensively about the terror of flying unescorted deep into Germany. His diary entries from the summer and fall of 1943 provide a visceral account of what bomber crews experienced on every mission. August 17, 1943, Regensburg mission. We watched the fighters turn back at the border and we knew what was coming. For the next 3 hours we would be alone against everything the Luftwaffe could throw at us. The flak was bad, thicker than I had ever seen it, black puffs filling the sky so densely that it seemed impossible to fly through without being hit. But the fighters were worse. They came at us from every angle, dozens of them, maybe 100. Attacking in waves that never seemed to stop. F-109s and F-190s, some painted in bright colors, some in camouflage, all of them firing, their cannon shells leaving smoke trails as they arced toward us. We shot down several. Our gunners were good, they had been trained well, and they hit what they aimed at, but the Germans kept coming, and every few minutes, another fort would go down. I saw one bomber take a hit in the No. 3 engine. The engine exploded and tore away from the wing, and fire spread across the wing so fast that the crew did not have time to bail out before the aircraft rolled over and went into a spin. I saw another bomber break apart in midair when a 30mm shell hit the bomb bay and detonated the bombs still on board. The explosion was so violent that aircraft flying nearby were hit by debris. By the time we reached the target, we had lost 6 bombers from our group. By the time we got home, it was 9 out of 18 that started. Half our group gone in a single mission. We landed at an emergency field in North Africa because we did not have enough fuel to make it back to England. When I climbed out of the aircraft and looked at the damage, I could not believe we had survived. There were over 200 holes in the fuselage, wings and tail. The rudder was shredded. 2 engines were barely running. The hydraulic system was destroyed, and we were the lucky ones. We made it. 9 crews did not. How many more missions until it is our turn? The question haunted every bomber crew, and the answer was statistically inevitable. With loss rates running between 10 and 20% on deep penetration missions, and with 25 missions required to complete a combat tour, the mathematics were brutal. A 10% loss rate meant that after 10 missions, statistically speaking, every bomber in the formation would have been shot down at least once. Individual crews might get lucky, surviving mission after mission through skill or chance, but on average the odds of completing 25 missions approached 0. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than they could be replaced, and more critically, they were losing experienced crews who understood the intricacies of formation, flying and bombing tactics, and who had developed the situational awareness that sometimes meant the difference between survival and death. The replacements who arrived to fill the gaps were young, inexperienced, barely out of training, and they died even faster than the veterans because they did not know the tricks that might keep them alive. Bomber crews arriving in England in the fall of 1943 would fly a handful of missions and be dead within weeks, never having had time to learn the subtle skills that might have saved them. The crisis reached its apex in the fall of 1943, and it was exemplified not just by the Schweinfurt raid but by a series of missions in August, September and October that produced casualty rates so high that they threatened to collapse the entire strategic bombing campaign. On August 17, the 8th Air Force launched a dual mission striking Regensburg and Schweinfurt simultaneously, attempting to split German defenses by attacking 2 targets at once. The missions were executed, but at terrible cost. 60 bombers failed to return from the combined missions, and another 87 were damaged so badly that they required major repairs before they could fly again. On October 8, a mission to Bremen cost 30 bombers. On October 10, Münster cost 30 more, and then came the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, which cost 60 bombers in a single afternoon, and forced General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, to travel to England personally to assess whether the daylight bombing campaign could continue at all. Arnold was a hard man, a pioneer aviator who had learned to fly from the Wright brothers themselves in 1911, who had spent his entire adult life in military aviation, and who believed absolutely in the doctrine of strategic bombing as a war-winning weapon. He had staked his career and his reputation on the premise that American bombers could destroy German industry from the air, crippling the Nazi war machine and paving the way for an eventual invasion of Europe. But even Arnold could not ignore the casualty figures that were being reported from England. The loss rates were unsustainable. Crew morale was collapsing under the weight of knowing that survival was statistically impossible. And most critically, the bombing campaign was not achieving its strategic objectives because too many bombers were being shot down before they could reach their targets. And those that did reach their targets were often so badly damaged that their bombing accuracy suffered. Arnold met with Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, in November 1943, and the conversation was brutal in its honesty. Arnold wanted to know why the bombing campaign was failing to achieve its objectives, why loss rates remained so high, why German fighter opposition seemed to be increasing rather than decreasing, despite months of bombing attacks on German aircraft factories. Eaker explained the situation with the cold clarity of a man who understood he was fighting a losing battle. The problem was range. American escort fighters could not accompany bombers deep into Germany because they lacked the fuel capacity to make the round trip. Without continuous fighter escort, the bombers were being slaughtered by German fighters that could attack with impunity once the American escorts turned back. Eaker had been requesting longer-range fighters for months, but the aircraft industry had not yet produced a fighter with sufficient range to escort bombers all the way to targets in central Germany. The P-38 Lightning had better range than the P-47, but there were not enough P-38s to provide adequate escort coverage, and the P-38 suffered from engine problems in the cold, damp climate of northern Europe that limited its effectiveness. Arnold's response was direct and uncompromising. "Fix it, or I will find someone who can." The 8th Air Force had 6 months to achieve air superiority over Germany. If that could not be accomplished, the entire strategy of daylight precision bombing would be abandoned. American air effort would be redirected supporting ground operations in preparation for the invasion of France, and the billions of dollars that had been invested in building a strategic bombing force would be written off as a failed experiment. It was the ultimate bureaucratic threat, and Eaker understood that his career was on the line. More importantly, thousands of airmen who had died over Germany might have died for nothing if the strategy was declared a failure. The solution, when it finally arrived, came in the form of a sleek silver fighter aircraft that had been in development since 1940 but had only recently been transformed from a mediocre performer into what many historians would later call the best all-around fighter aircraft of World War II. The North American P-51 Mustang had been designed originally to meet a British requirement for additional fighter aircraft to supplement the Spitfire. North American Aviation, a company with no experience building fighters, had taken a clean sheet of paper approach to the design, incorporating lessons learned from examining capture. The initial versions of the P-51, powered by Allison V1710 engines, were fast at low altitude, over 390 miles per hour at sea level, but they lacked the high-altitude performance needed for bomber escort duties because the Allison engine lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. The British had used early P-51s for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, roles where low-altitude performance mattered, but the aircraft was not suitable for escorting bombers that operated at 25,000 feet or higher. Then in 1942, someone, and history records conflicting accounts of exactly who deserves credit for the idea, suggested fitting the P-51 airframe with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire and which had superb high-altitude performance. Rolls-Royce had licensed production of the Merlin to Packard Motor Company in the United States, and Packard was producing Merlins by the thousands for use in various aircraft. The marriage of the P-51 airframe with the Packard Merlin engine created a fighter that exceeded every expectation. The P-51B, the first Merlin-powered variant to enter production, began arriving in England in late 1943, and the aircraft's performance characteristics were nothing short of revolutionary. Top speed at altitude exceeded 40 miles per hour, making it faster than any German fighter in service. Rate of climb was over 3,000 feet per minute, allowing it to reach operational altitude quickly and to maintain energy in combat. Maneuverability was excellent, better than the P-47 and competitive with the Bf-10-109 and F-190 in most flight regimes. But the most critical characteristic was range. With internal fuel tanks and external drop tanks, the P-51 had a combat radius exceeding 650 miles, which meant it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back with fuel to spare for combat. For the first time in the war, war, American bombers would have continuous fighter escort from takeoff to landing and the death zone would cease to exist. The impact on bomber crew morale was immediate. Crews who had been flying missions knowing they would be alone over Germany for hours were suddenly being told that P-51s would be with them the entire way. It seemed too good to be true, and initially many crews were skeptical. They had heard promises before, but when the P-51s began flying escort missions in December 1943 and January 1944, and bomber crews saw those sleek silver fighters staying with them deep into Germany, the skepticism turned to cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, they would survive their tours after all. But having long-range fighters was only part of the solution, and this is where the story becomes more than just a tale of technological superiority. Having the capability to escort bombers deep into Germany was meaningless if the fighters were used incorrectly, and in late 1943 American fighter doctrine was fundamentally defensive. Fighters were assigned to stay close to bomber formations, to fly in formation with the bombers, to react to German attacks but not to initiate combat unless German fighters directly threatened the bombers. The doctrine made a certain kind of sense from the perspective of bomber commanders who wanted maximum protection for their aircraft, but it surrendered the initiative to the Germans and allowed Luftwaffe fighters to choose when and where to attack. German pilots who were often more experienced than their American counterparts and who were flying over their own territory with the advantage of ground-controlled intercept systems could watch the American formations, identify weak points in the escort coverage, and mask their attacks at times and places where they had local superiority. The result was that even with escort fighters present, bombers were still taking heavy losses because the escorts were reactive rather than proactive. The change in doctrine came from a man who understood fighter combat at a level that few other senior commanders could match because he had actually flown fighters in combat and had spent years thinking about the tactical and strategic employment of air power. Major General James Harold Doolittle, better known as Jimmy Doolittle, arrived in England in January 1944 to take command of the 8th Air Force, replacing Ira Eaker, who was reassigned to command Allied air forces in the Mediterranean. Doolittle was 57 years old, which was ancient by fighter pilot standards, but his credentials were unmatched. He had joined the Army Air Service during World War I and had served as a flight instructor, teaching hundreds of pilots to fly. After the war, he had become one of the most famous aviators in America, winning the Schneider Trophy for seaplane racing in 1925, setting a world speed record, and completing the first flight across the United States in less than 24 hours. He had earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, writing a dissertation on the effects of accelerated flight on aircraft structures that contributed to understanding of high-speed aerodynamics. He had pioneered instrument flying, completing the first successful flight using only instruments without any outside visual references. He had left the military to work in private industry, becoming an executive at Shell Oil Company where he worked on aviation fuel development, and when war came he had returned to military service and led the famous Doolittle Raid in April 1942, launching 16 B-25 medium bombers from the aircraft carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo in a mission that was technically impossible, but which succeeded through audacity and meticulous planning. And Doolittle was a fighter pilot to his core, and he understood something fundamental about air combat that the bomber-centric leadership of the 8th Air Force had not fully grasped. Air superiority could not be achieved defensively. You did not win control of the air by protecting your bomber. You won it by destroying the enemy's fighters, and the only way to destroy fighters efficiently was to hunt them aggressively, to force them into combat on terms favorable to your own aircraft, to kill them before they could organize attacks on the bomber. On January 6, 1944, just days after assuming command, Doolittle visited the headquarters of the 8th Fighter Command at Bussey Hall and met with Brigadier General William Kepner, who commanded all fighter units assigned to the 8th Air Force. Kepner was a capable officer who had commanded fighters in the Pacific before being transferred to Europe, and he understood the frustrations that fighter pilots felt about being tied to bomber formations. But he also understood the political realities. Bomber commanders wanted their aircraft protected, and fighter escorts that ranged away from the bombers would be blamed if losses increased. It was safer, politically and literally, to keep fighters close to the formations even if that tactical doctrine was suboptimal. Doolittle walked into Kepner's office and immediately noticed a sign on the wall, prominently displayed where every visitor could see it. The sign read, in large block letters, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." It was the essence of the defensive doctrine that had governed fighter operations for over a year. Doolittle read the sign twice, his face expressionless, And then he turned to Kepner and said quietly, "That sign needs to come down. It's wrong." Kepner, who had been waiting for someone with enough authority and courage to change the doctrine, understood immediately what Doolittle was saying, and agreed without hesitation. Within hours the old sign was removed and a new sign was hung in its place. The new sign read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." The change in wording was simple, just a few words, but the implications were revolutionary and would transform the air war over Europe completely. If you were a P-51 pilot in January 1944, just given orders to leave the bombers behind and hunt German fighters alone deep over enemy territory, knowing that bomber crews were counting on you and that if you failed they would die, do you think you would have the courage to do it? Comment: I would try. Fighters were no longer tethered to bomber formations like sheepdogs guarding a flock. They would range ahead of the bomber stream, sometimes 50 miles or more in front, hunting for German fighters that were forming up to attack before those fighters ever reached the bombers. They would sweep the flanks of the bomber route, covering an area 25 miles or more to either side, engaging any German aircraft they encountered and preventing coordinated attacks from developing. And most critically, they would pursue. If German fighters attacked and then tried to break off and escape, American fighters would chase them down and kill them, even if that meant leaving the immediate vicinity of the bombers for extended periods. The goal was no longer to defend specific bomber formations. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe as a fighting force, to kill so many German fighters and pilots that the Luftwaffe would be unable to effectively challenge American air operations regardless of how many bombers were in the air. It was a shift from tactical defense to strategic offense, and it required a level of confidence in the superiority of American aircraft and pilots that not everyone in the 8th Air Force shared. Bomber commanders were horrified when they learned of the new policy. They had spent over a year watching their formations get torn apart by German fighters, and now they were being told that their escorts would not even stay close when they were available. It seemed like madness, like they were being abandoned to be slaughtered. Lieutenant Colonel Barney Lay, bomber pilot and staff officer who had survived the first Schweinfurt raid and who had written extensively about the terror of flying over Germany, wrote an angry letter to 8th Air Force headquarters. His letter made compelling arguments from the perspective of someone who had watched German fighters massacre bomber formations, and who could not imagine how freeing the escorts to Rome would somehow make bombers safer. But his letter was politely received and then filed away and ignored. Doolittle was not interested in opinions from people who did not understand fighter tactics. He was interested in results, and he was confident that aggressive fighter sweeps would destroy the Luftwaffe far more effectively than defensive formation flying ever could. Fighter pilots, by contrast, were elated by the new doctrine. For over a year they had been forced to fly predictable patterns around bomber formations, throttled back to match bomber speed, watching German fighters maneuver into attack positions, waiting for the Germans to commit before they could react. It was frustrating tactically because it surrendered every advantage that American fighters possessed. The P-47 and P-51 were faster than German fighters in level flight and in dives. They had superior high-altitude performance, they had better visibility from the cockpit, they had more ammunition, but all those advantages were wasted when they were forced to fly defensive formations around slow-moving bombers, reacting to German attacks rather than initiating combat. Now they were being told to do what every fighter pilot instinctively wanted to do, to seek out the enemy and destroy him before he could threaten friendly forces, to use speed and altitude and surprise to achieve tactical superiority, to fight on their own terms rather than on the enemy's terms. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, based at Deben, was one of the most experienced and aggressive fighter leaders in the 8th Air Force. He had flown with the Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons before transferring to the U.S. Army Air Forces, and he had over a year of combat experience and multiple confirmed kills. When Blakesley received the directive outlining the new fighter tactics, he gathered his pilots in the ready room and told them with barely contained excitement, "Gentlemen, we are no longer shepherds guarding sheep. We are wolves, and we are being unleashed to hunt. General Doolittle has given us permission to do what we have been wanting to do since we arrived in this theater. Find the enemy, kill him. Do not wait for him to attack the bombers. Do not tie yourselves to formations. Fly ahead, fly high, fly fast, and shoot down every German aircraft you see. The Luftwaffe has been having things their own way for too long. That ends now." The psychological shift among fighter pilots was immediate and profound. Morale, which had been good, but constrained by the frustrations of defensive tactics, soared. Pilots who had been cautious about pursuing German fighters for fear of being criticized for leaving the bombers now had explicit orders to be aggressive. The mental calculus changed from how do I protect bombers to how do I kill the maximum number of German fighters, and that shift in mindset would prove to be as important as any technological advantage. The first test of the new tactics came on January 29, 1944, during a large-scale mission to Frankfurt. The 8th Air Force dispatched over 800 heavy bombers to strike industrial targets in and around Frankfurt, escorted by nearly 600 fighters including several squadrons of P-51 Mustangs that were flying their first major escort missions. The P-51s from the 3057th Fighter Group, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hayes, were assigned to range ahead of the bomber stream and clear the route of German fighters. Hayes took his squadron to 28,000 feet and flew 40 miles ahead of the bombers, positioning himself along the expected bomber track and watching for German fighters. At approximately 1340 hours, Hayes spotted a large formation of German aircraft below and to the south, perhaps 50 Bith-109s flying in loose formation at around 24,000. The German fighters were climbing and maneuvering into position for an attack on the bomber stream, but they had not yet committed to their attack run. Hayes assessed the tactical situation instantly. His squadron had the altitude advantage and the element of surprise. The Germans were focused on positioning for their attack and were not watching above and behind them. The P-51s were faster and could dive on the German formation before the Germans could react. Hayes made the decision in seconds. He rolled his aircraft inverted, pulled into a steep dive and led his squadron into the German formation from above and behind. The attack was devastating. The P-51s dove through the German formation at over 450 miles per hour, firing short bursts as they closed, and German fighters began falling out of the sky before most of the Luftwaffe pilots even realized they were under attack. Hayes shot down 2 Bf-109s in his initial pass, one of them exploding as his .50 caliber rounds hit the engine and fuel tank, the other spinning toward the ground with its engine smoking and its canopy shattered. Other pilots in his squadron scored similar kills. In the space of less than 3 minutes, 13 German fighters were destroyed and the rest of the formation scattered, their coordinated attack broken before it could begin. Not a single German fighter from that formation reached the bombers. The 357th Fighter Group lost 2 aircraft in the engagement. Both pilots bailed out and were captured, but the exchange ratio of 13-2 was precisely what Doolittle had predicted. If American fighters could consistently achieve those kinds of kill ratios, the Luftwaffe would be bled white within months. Other fighter groups had similar successes that day. The 4th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, encountered German fighters taking off from an airfield near the bomber route, and dove on them while they were still climbing, shooting down 7 before the Germans could gain enough altitude to fight effectively. The 56th Fighter Group engaged a mixed formation of B-109s and F-90s west of Frankfurt and destroyed 11 German fighters for the loss of 3 P-47. In total, American fighter pilots claimed over 60 German aircraft destroyed on January 29, while bomber losses were the lowest they had been in months. Despite the heavy defenses around Frankfurt, the bombers had completed their mission, striking their targets and inflicting significant damage on German industry. But what was more important strategically was that the escorts had destroyed 60 German fighters that would never attack another bomber, and they had done it by ranging ahead and attacking aggressively rather than staying tied to the bomber formation. The new tactics were working exactly as Doolittle had predicted, and bomber crews who had been so skeptical began to change their assessment when they noticed that German fighter attacks were less coordinated and less effective than they had been in previous missions. The escorts were thinning out the Luftwaffe before the Luftwaffe could reach the bombers, and the effect was undeniable. February 1944 brought the decisive test of Doolittle's strategy in the form of Operation Argument, which would become known to history as Big Week. The plan had been developed by operational planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters and approved by Doolittle with the full support of General Carl Spaatz, who commanded all American strategic air forces in Europe. The concept was audacious and reflected the new offensive mentality that Doolittle had brought to the 8th Air Force. Rather than attacking targets opportunistically as weather and tactical considerations allowed, Big Week would be a coordinated, sustained offensive against the German aircraft industry, striking every major aircraft factory and assembly plant within range of American bombers over the course of 6 consecutive days. The 8th Air Force based in England would strike targets in northern and central Germany, while the 15th Air Force based in Italy would strike targets in southern Germany and Austria, forcing the Luftwaffe to defend on 2 fronts simultaneously and preventing German fighters from concentrating against either bombing force. But the destruction of factories was only a secondary objective. The primary goal of Big Week was to force the Luftwaffe into battle on a scale that would allow American fighters to inflict catastrophic losses on German fighter units. The bombers in a very real sense were bait. The fighters would do the killing. It was the logical extension of Doolittle's doctrine, the application of offensive fighter tactics on a strategic scale, and if it succeeded, it would break the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. The weather had been terrible for weeks, with heavy cloud cover and storms grounding most air operations across Europe. Strategic bombing required visual conditions over the target for accurate bombing, and persistent bad weather had limited operations through most of January and early February. But meteorologists predicted a break in the weather beginning around February 20, a high-pressure system moving across Europe that would bring clear skies for. They would range ahead of the bombers, sweep the flanks, engage German fighters wherever they found them, and pursue relentlessly. The goal was not just to protect the bombers, though that would be a welcome consequence. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe. The first day of Big Week, February 20, produced exactly the kind of massive air battle that Allied planners had hoped for. The Luftwaffe responded to the American attack with everything it had, launching hundreds of fighters from bases across Germany to defend the aircraft factories. But A-109s and FW-190s rose to meet the bombers, and the sky over central Germany became a chaotic swirl of dogfights as American escort fighters engaged German interceptors at every altitude from ground level to 35,000 feet. The fighting was brutal and confused, with aircraft diving and turning and firing in a three-dimensional melee that stretched across hundreds of miles. P-51 Mustangs, using their superior speed and altitude performance, stalked German fighters that were climbing to intercept the bombers, diving on them before the Germans could reach attack altitude and shooting them down before they could threaten the bomber formations. P-47 Thunderbolts, using their legendary durability and heavy firepower, engaged German fighters in turning combat at medium altitudes, trading blows in extended dogfights that tested pilot skill and aircraft performance. Some German pilots, recognizing that they were outnumbered and outmatched, attempted to disengage and escape to fight another day, but American fighters pursued them relentlessly, chasing them down even when it meant flying 50 miles away from the bomber stream. This was exactly what Doolittle had ordered, to kill German fighters wherever they could be found, and the American pilots used those orders with devastating effectiveness. By the end of the first day, American fighter pilots had claimed over 60 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, with another 20 destroyed on the ground when P-51 strafed airfields they encountered during their sweeps. German fighter pilots claimed 21 American bombers shot down, a significant number but far fewer than they had achieved on previous deep penetration missions. The exchange ratio was clearly in favor of the Americans, and more importantly, the pattern established on the first day would repeat itself over the next 5 days. February 21 brought attacks on aircraft factories at Brunswick and Die-Pfalz, with American fighters claiming 58 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 16 bombers. February 22 saw strikes on targets across Germany, including major attacks on Regensburg and Gotha, with American fighters claiming 64 German aircraft destroyed. February 24, after a one-day pause for weather, brought renewed attacks on Schweinfurt, the target that had cost so dearly in October, but this time the result was entirely different. Protected by aggressive fighter sweeps that destroyed German fighters before they could organize coordinated attacks, the bombers struck Schweinfurt and returned with losses that were a fraction of what they had been 4 months earlier. February 25, the final day of Big Week, saw attacks on Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and other targets in southern Germany, with the 15th Air Force joining the battle and striking targets in Austria that the 8th Air Force could not reach. When Big Week concluded on February 25, the cumulative effect on the Luftwaffe was devastating beyond what even the most optimistic planners had predicted. Over the 6 days of the offensive, the Luftwaffe had lost over 355 fighters destroyed in combat, with another 100 damaged beyond immediate repair. The aircraft losses were significant, but they were not irreplaceable. German aircraft production was actually increasing in early 1944, a testament to the organizational genius of Albert Speer and the resilience of German industry even under sustained bombing. But aircraft without pilots were useless pieces of machinery, and the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 100 pilots killed or seriously wounded during Big Week, and many of those were experienced veterans who could not be replaced. A pilot with 500 hours of combat time, who understood energy management and deflection, shooting and situational awareness, who had survived dozens of combat missions and knew the thousand small details that separated skilled pilots from dead pilots. That pilot was worth 10 aircraft because he could use those aircraft effectively. When he died, all that experience and skill died with him, and the replacement who took his place would be a boy with minimal training who would likely die within weeks. The Luftwaffe was losing veterans at a rate it could not sustain, and the pipeline of trained replacements was broken beyond repair. The training crisis that was crippling the Luftwaffe in early 1944 was the result of converging factors that had been building throughout the war. In 1940 and 1941, Luftwaffe pilot training had been comprehensive and lengthy, with new pilots receiving over 200 hours of flight time before being assigned to combat units, including extensive training in aerobatics, formation flying, gunnery, and tactical doctrine. The Luftwaffe had the fuel to support that level of training, the aircraft to fly, and the time to do it properly, because the war seemed to be going well and there was no urgent need to rush pilots to the front. By 1943, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. Allied bombing had destroyed training facilities and aircraft production plants. Fuel shortages were becoming chronic as Allied strategic bombing targeted synthetic fuel plants and as the Soviet advance overran Romanian oil fields. Most critically, experienced instructors were being pulled out of training units and sent to combat units to replace losses, leaving the training schools staffed by pilots who themselves lacked experience. The result was a vicious cycle. Training time was cut from 2,000 hours to 60, then to 120, then to less than 100 hours as the need for replacements became desperate. Pilots graduating from these abbreviated programs lacked the skills to survive in combat, so they died quickly, creating a need for even more replacements, which put even more pressure on the training system to produce pilots faster, which meant cutting training time even further. By early 1944, some replacement pilots arriving at combat units had less than 60 hours of total flight time, with almost no combat training and minimal experience in the aircraft they would be flying operationally. These pilots were being sent into combat against American and British pilots who had hundreds of hours of flight time and months of combat experience, flying aircraft that were equal or superior in performance, and the results were predictable and tragic. Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 confirmed victories, almost all of them on the Eastern Front where he had become a legend for his tactical brilliance and astonishing kill count, was transferred to the Western Front in early 1944 to assess the situation and to help train replacement pilots. Hartmann was appalled by what he found. In his diary, and in post-war interviews, he described the training situation as catastrophic, and the replacement pilots as lambs being sent to slaughter. March 15, 1944 entry in Hartmann's diary reads, "I observed a training flight today at Wyazba. The instructor was a lieutenant with perhaps 50 hours of combat time, barely experienced enough to keep himself alive. The students were boys, 17 and 18 years old, who handled their aircraft like beginners, because that is what they are. They do not know how to dogfight. They do not understand energy management. They do not know how to use their aircraft's strengths or avoid its weaknesses. They are being taught to fly in formation, and to follow orders, and to point their aircraft at the enemy and shoot. And that is the extent of their training. In 6 weeks they will be sent to combat units. In 6 weeks and 3 days, most of them will be dead." I tried to explain to the base commander that these pilots need more training, that sending them to combat in their current state is murder, but he told me there is no time and no fuel for extended training. The units need pilots now. The factories are producing aircraft faster than we can find pilots to fly them, so we send them to die because we have no choice. This is not war, this is slaughter, and I do not know how to stop it. Hartmann attempted to implement better training programs, drawing on his extensive combat experience to teach tactics that might give replacement pilots a chance of survival. He emphasized the importance of maintaining situational awareness, of never losing sight of the enemy, of using altitude and speed to control engagements, of attacking from advantageous positions and refusing combat when the odds were unfavorable. These were the lessons that had kept Hartmann alive through hundreds of combat missions, and he tried desperately to pass them on to the next generation. But there was no time to teach properly. The pilots were rushed through abbreviated programs and sent to the front with barely enough skill to. The mission was both a strategic strike and a psychological statement. Berlin was the most heavily defended city in Germany, ringed with anti-aircraft batteries and protected by elite fighter units. Attacking Berlin in daylight was a direct challenge to the Luftwaffe, a statement that American air power had reached the point where no target in Germany was beyond reach. The Luftwaffe responded with approximately 60 fighters, a significant force but far smaller than what they would have been able to field 6 months earlier. In the air battles that developed over Berlin and along the bomber routes, American fighters claimed 82 German aircraft destroyed. German fighters managed to shoot down 69 American bombers, a painful loss that represented over 600 airmen killed or captured. But the loss rate was actually lower than it had been on earlier deep penetration missions, despite Berlin being the most heavily defended target in Germany. More importantly, the Luftwaffe had committed 160 fighters to the defense and had lost approximately half of them, either shot down in combat or damaged beyond immediate repair, leaving those units unable to challenge subsequent raids until they could be reinforced and refitted. Johannes Wiese, a highly decorated German fighter ace with over 130 confirmed victories, flew with JG-77 Herz's against the Berlin raid on March 6. Field was a skilled and experienced pilot who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts, and he understood better than most how the tactical situation had shifted. His letter to his family, written on the evening of March 6 and recovered after the war, provides a stark assessment of the situation from the German perspective. My dearest mother and father, I am writing this tonight because I do not know if I will have the opportunity to write again. Today we flew against the Americans over Berlin. It was the largest air battle I have ever seen, hundreds of aircraft filling the sky, bombers in tight formations protected by escorts that seemed to be everywhere at once. We climbed to altitude and attempted to organize our attack, but the American fighters found us before we could reach the bombers. They dove on us from above. P-51s and P-47s, and the fight that followed was chaos. I shot down one bomber, a fortress that fell away from formation with 2 engines burning, but I nearly died doing it because the escorts were so aggressive and so numerous. Everywhere I looked there were American fighters, 5 or 10 for every German aircraft, all of them faster than us, all flown by men who knew what they were doing. We lost 17 aircraft from our Geschwader today, 17. Some of the pilots bailed out and may survive, most did not. These were men I have known for years, men who had dozens of kills, experienced veterans who understood how to fight and survive, and the Americans shot them down as if they were beginners. I do not know how much longer we can sustain these losses. The Americans seem to have unlimited aircraft and pilots. We do not. Every day we lose men we cannot replace, and every day the Americans grow stronger. I flew with 120 pilots in 1941 when I joined the Geschwader. Of those 120, fewer than 20 are still alive. The rest are dead or prisoners or so badly wounded they will never fly again. I have been lucky, but luck does not last forever. I am writing this to tell you that if I do not return, I died doing my duty, and you should be proud that I served my country. But I also want you to know that the war in the air is lost. We cannot win. The Americans are simply too strong, and we are too weak. It is only a matter of time. Your loving son, Johannes Wiese, survived the war, one of the few pilots from his unit who did, but most of his squadron was dead within 6 months, killed in the grinding attrition of daily combat against an enemy that outnumbered them and outmatched them in nearly every respect. The collapse of the Luftwaffe accelerated through the spring of 1944, and by April the effects were visible to everyone involved. In April, the 8th Air Force flew 21 major missions deep into Germany, striking targets from Berlin to Munich to Augsburg to Stuttgart. On several of those missions, the bombers encountered no German fighter opposition whatsoever. The Luftwaffe had not been destroyed completely. German factories were still producing fighters, and production numbers were actually reaching all-time highs as Speer's industrial reorganization took full effect. In July 1944, German factories would produce over 3,000 fighter aircraft, more than any previous month of the war. But those aircraft sat on airfields unable to fly because there was no fuel to put in their tanks, no spare parts to maintain them, and most critically, no trained pilots to fly them. The fuel shortage was becoming catastrophic as Allied bombing systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production capacity. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, struck the Plaidio fields in Romania repeatedly through the spring and summer of 1944, reducing Romanian oil exports to Germany. The Soviet advance was threatening other oil sources in the east. German synthetic fuel plants, which had been producing enough fuel to meet military needs in 1943, were being bombed so heavily that production was falling even as demand was increasing. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was rationing fuel so strictly that training flights were nearly impossible, and even operational units sometimes lacked enough fuel to fly missions. Aircraft that might have challenged Allied bombers sat grounded for lack of fuel, and pilots who might have flown them sat idle for lack of training. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper, a force that appeared formidable in organizational charts and production statistics, but which had ceased to function as an effective fighting force. On May 8, the 8th Air Force dispatched over 900 bombers to strike targets across Germany, escorted by more than 750 fighters. The mission plan called for attacks on aircraft factories, rail yards, and oil refineries, targets that would have been suicidally dangerous to attack 6 months earlier. But on May 8, not a single German fighter rose to challenge the American formations. The bombers flew to their targets, dropped their bombs with minimal opposition beyond anti-aircraft fire, and flew home. 0 fighters encountered, 0 fighters destroyed, 0 bomber losses to fighter attack. The Luftwaffe, which had been the most formidable air force in the world in 1940, which had destroyed the Polish Air Force and the French Air Force and nearly destroyed the Royal Air Force, had been reduced to irrelevance in less than 6 months through systematic attrition that it could not sustain. General Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in early May that the fighter force was effectively destroyed as a strategic asset. We have aircraft in depots awaiting pilots. We have pilots in training schools awaiting aircraft and fuel, but we cannot bring these elements together in a way that allows us to mount effective resistance against American daylight bombing. The training system has collapsed. Our fuel production has been bombed into insignificant. Our experienced pilots are dead. The replacements we are receiving have insufficient training to survive in combat. The Americans have complete air superiority over Germany. They can bomb any target they choose with minimal losses. We can do nothing to stop them. The war in the air is over, and we have lost. 1 month later, on June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, and the air superiority that Doolittle's fighter offensive had achieved proved to be decisive in ensuring the invasion's success. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day, an average of nearly 1 sortie per minute for the entire 24-hour period. Fighter bombers attacked German positions along the coast. Medium bombers struck transportation choke points to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Heavy bombers, operating in daylight with near impunity, struck coastal defenses and inland positions. Fighters provided continuous air cover over the invasion fleet in the beaches, ensuring that no German aircraft could interfere with the landings. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300 sorties on D-Day, and most of those were ineffective harassment missions flown by inexperienced pilots who were immediately engaged by Allied fighters and forced to jettison their bombs and flee. German fighters attempting to strafe the beaches were shot down before they could complete their attacks. German reconnaissance aircraft trying to assess the situation were intercepted and destroyed. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to such impotence that it could not even perform basic reconnaissance over the largest amphibious invasion in history. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France and one of the most skilled commanders Germany produced during the war, understood immediately that the battle for France was lost before it had really begun, not because of anything happening on the ground but because of what had happened in the air over the previous 6 months. In a letter to his wife written on June 8, 1944, Rommel wrote with uncharacteristic despair, "The enemy has complete air superiority. Our columns cannot move during daylight without being attacked from the air. Our supplies do not reach the front. Our reinforcements are destroyed before they arrive at the battle. I have never in my career felt so helpless. We cannot fight effectively when we cannot move, and we cannot move because enemy aircraft attack everything that moves. The Luftwaffe is nowhere to be seen. I have been told that our fighter units are being held back to defend the Reich, but what good does it do to defend factories when we are losing the war at the front? Without control of the air, we cannot win. The battle is lost." The letter was intercepted by Allied intelligence and provided valuable insight into German command thinking, but its contents were not surprising to anyone who understood how completely the Luftwaffe had been neutralized. The transformation that had occurred between October 1943 and June 1944 was absolute and historically unprecedented. In 8 months, the entire strategic balance of air power in Europe had reversed. In October 1943, American bomber formations could not survive deep penetration missions into Germany without suffering losses that threatened the viability of the entire strategic bombing campaign. By June 1944, American bombers operated over Germany virtually at will, attacking any target they chose with loss rates that, while still painful, were sustainable and acceptable given the strategic objectives being achieved. The kill ratios told the story with brutal mathematical clarity. In the fall of 1943, the Luftwaffe was achieving aerial combat kill ratios of approximately 2-to-1 in its favor, meaning for every 2 American aircraft shot down, 1 German aircraft was lost. By the spring of 1944, that ratio had reversed to 4-to-1, or even 5-to-1 in favor of the Americans, and on some missions the ratio was even more lopsided. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,500 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded, representing more than half of the total fighter pilot strength the Luftwaffe had possessed at the beginning of 1944. Those losses included not just inexperienced replacements but hundreds of veteran pilots, men with years of combat experience and dozens or hundreds of victories, men who understood air combat at an instinctive level and who could have trained the next generation if they had survived. Once those veterans were dead, the institutional knowledge they possessed died with them, and it could not be recovered or recreated within the time available. American losses during the same period were significant. Over 2,000 American heavy bombers were shot down down or damaged beyond repair between January and June 1944, representing the loss of over 20,000 aircrew killed, wounded, or captured. American fighter losses totaled several hundred aircraft, with corresponding pilot casualties. These were not trivial losses. Every bomber that went down represented 10 men who would not return home, and every fighter that was shot down represented a skilled pilot who had been trained at great expense, and who could not be easily replaced. But American losses, while painful on an individual and human level, were sustainable on a strategic level, because American industrial capacity and training infrastructure could replace losses faster than they occurred. American factories were producing over 8,000 aircraft per month by mid-1944, including over 2,000 fighters and over 1,500 heavy bombers. Training programs across the United States were graduating thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners every month, more than enough to replace combat losses and to expand the forces available for operations. The replacement pipeline was full and functioning smoothly, and the quality of American pilots was actually improving over time as the training programs refined their methods and as combat veterans rotated back to training duties to pass on lessons learned. Germany had no equivalent capacity. German aircraft production was impressive considering the circumstances, with output actually increasing through mid-1944 despite sustained Allied bombing, but the pilot training system had collapsed completely and could not be rebuilt while the war was ongoing. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force capable of influencing the outcome of the war. German fighters still flew, particularly on the Eastern Front, where Soviet air tactics were less sophisticated and where German pilots could sometimes still achieve favorable kill ratios against less experienced Soviet pilots flying inferior aircraft. But in the West, Luftwaffe operations were limited to small-scale defensive patrols and occasional harassment raids that were easily brushed aside by overwhelming Allied numerical and qualitative superiority. The introduction of the Messerschmitt Me-26-2 jet fighter in the fall of 1944 represented a potential game-changer from a technological perspective. The Me-26-2 was significantly faster than any Allied fighter, with a top speed exceeding 540 miles per hour, and it was heavily armed with 4 30mm cannons that could destroy a bomber with a single burst. But the Me-26-2 arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the strategic outcome. Only about 1,400 Me-26-2s were produced before the war ended, and of those, fewer than 300 ever saw combat because of fuel shortages, spare parts shortages, and lack of trained pilots who could fly such an advanced aircraft effectively. The Me-26-2 required different flying techniques than conventional fighters, and pilots who had learned to fly Bayer 109s and Flyer 190s needed extensive transition training to operate jets safely. But there was no time for that training, and no fuel to conduct it, even if time had been available. So the Me-26-2 sat on airfields, technologically impressive, but strategically irrelevant, while the war ground on toward its inevitable conclusion. Erich Rudorfer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 220 confirmed victories who flew both conventional fighters and jets during the final year of the war, reflected bitterly in post-war interviews, "We had jets that could outfly anything the Allies had. We had new fighters with better performance than our old models, but we had no pilots who could use them effectively, and we had no fuel to fly them even if we had the pilots. The Americans killed all our experienced pilots in the spring of 1944. Everything that came after was just a prolonged death. The war was already over. We just had not admitted it yet." The strategic implications of Doolittle's decision extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories achieved in 1944. The doctrine of offensive air operation, the recognition that air superiority must be seized through aggressive action rather than achieved through defensive postures, became the foundation of American and Allied air power doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. The lessons learned over the skies of Germany in 1944 were systematically studied and incorporated into Air Force training and operational planning in the decades that followed. During the Korean War, when American forces again faced a numerically significant enemy air force in the form of Soviet-supplied MiG-15 jets flown by Chinese, North Korean, and occasionally Soviet pilot, American fighter tactics emphasized offensive sweeps and aggressive pursuit rather than close escort of bomber formations. F-86 Sabre pilots would range ahead of strike packages, seek out MiG-15s and engage them in air superiority battles that often took place far from the bombers they were nominally protecting. The result was a kill ratio heavily favorable favoring American pilot because American aircraft were dramatically superior. The MiG-15 was actually a very capable fighter, but because American tactics and pilot training emphasized offensive aggression and because American pilots were better trained and more experienced than most of their opponents during the Vietnam War, the application of offensive air superiority tactics was complicated by political restrictions that limited where American aircraft could operate and by an enemy that could retreat into sanctuaries in North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia where American fighters could not pursue. But even within those constraints, the doctrine remained fundamentally offensive. Fighter sweeps, barrier combat air patrols designed to intercept North Vietnamese fighters before they could reach American strike packages in aggressive pursuit of any enemy aircraft that attempted to engage. These were the tactics that American fighter pilots employed, and they were direct descendants of the doctrine that Doolittle had established in January 9. The introduction of Operation Bolo in January 1967, where American F-4 Phantoms disguised themselves as vulnerable F-105 strike aircraft and ambushed North Vietnamese MiG-21s that rose to attack them, was a perfect example of offensive fighter tactics taken to the level of deliberate deception. The operation worked brilliantly, destroying 7 MiG-21s in a single engagement, because it seized the initiative and forced the enemy to react on American terms. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the first phase of the air campaign was dedicated entirely to achieving air superiority by destroying Iraqi air defenses and fighter aircraft. Coalition fighters conducted aggressive offensive counter-air missions, seeking out Iraqi fighters and destroying them in the air and on the ground, while suppression of enemy air defenses missions systematically dismantled the radar and missile systems that protected Iraqi airspace. Once air superiority was achieved, which took less than a week, coalition aircraft operated over Iraq with near total freedom, attacking ground targets with minimal losses and providing close air support that proved decisive in the ground campaign. The pattern was always the same: attack the enemy's air force first, destroy it as quickly and as completely as possible, and only then turn attention to other targets. It was Doolittle's lesson, proven over Germany in 1944, applied over and over in conflicts around the world for the next 7 decades. Doolittle himself, characteristically modest about his accomplishments despite being one of the most celebrated aviators of his generation, reflected on the decision to change fighter tactics during several post-war interviews. In a 1971 interview conducted for the Air Force Oral History program, he was asked directly whether changing the fighter doctrine had been a difficult decision given the opposition from bomber advocates, and the risk that it might have backfired if the tactics had not worked as intended. Doolittle's response was thoughtful and provided insight into his decision-making process. "It was the hardest decision I made during my time commanding the 8th Air Force," he said. "Harder than planning specific missions, harder than deciding which targets to strike, harder even than leading the Tokyo raid, because in that case I was only gambling with my own life and the lives of men who had volunteered for a dangerous mission, knowing the risks. With the fighter doctrine change, I was making a decision that would affect thousands of bomber crewmen who had no choice in the matter, men who depended on fighter escorts for their survival. If I was wrong, if the new tactics did not work, those men would die, and their deaths would be my responsibility. The bomber commanders thought I was abandoning them. Some of my own staff thought I was taking an unnecessary risk with tactics that had not been tested in combat. But I had flown fighters in World War I, and in the years between the wars, I had thought about air combat tactics extensively during my years in private industry, and I knew from experience and from studying the problem that you cannot win in the air by defending. Defense is inherently reactive. It surrenders the initiative to the enemy and allows him to choose the time and place of combat. Defensive action seizes the initiative and forces the enemy to react to you. That is true in air combat, just as it is true in ground combat or naval combat. The old doctrine of close escort was defensive. We were reacting to German attacks rather than preventing those attacks from developing. The new doctrine was offensive. We attacked German fighters before they could organize attacks on our bombers. We forced them to fight on our terms rather than on theirs, and it worked, but only because we had the resources to sustain it. We had aircraft that were equal or superior to German fighters. We had pilots who were well-trained and aggressive. We had the industrial capacity to replace our losses faster than they occurred. And critically, we had long-range fighters that could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. If we had tried offensive fighter tactics in 1942, we would have been slaughtered because we did not have those advantages yet. Timing matters in war as much as tactics do. You have to understand what is possible, given given your available resources and your enemy's capabilities, and you have to make decisions based on that understanding rather than on ideology or wishful thinking. The two sides of the original that read the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive, and the replacement that read the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters, are preserved today in the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. They hang side by side in a dedicated display that explains the historical context and the consequences of the doctrinal change. Thousand visitors see them every year, most of them unaware of the strategic revolution those two simple signs represent. The change was not merely a change in wording or a change in tactical procedures. It was a fundamental change in how air power was understood and employed. It was a recognition that air superiority cannot be achieved through passive defense, that control of the air must be seized through aggressive offensive action, that the purpose of fighter aircraft is not to protect other assets but to destroy enemy aircraft wherever and whenever they can be found. That lesson learned in blood and sacrifice over the skies of Germany in 1944 remains as relevant today as it was 8 decades ago, because the fundamental nature of aerial combat has not changed despite advances in technology that would seem miraculous to the men who fought in propeller-driven fighters, armed with machine guns and cannon. Modern stealth fighters with beyond visual range missiles and sophisticated electronic warfare systems still operate according to the same basic principles: seize the initiative, force the enemy to react to you, destroy the enemy's air force so completely that he cannot challenge your freedom of action. These are Doolittle's principles, and they remain the foundation of air combat doctrine in every professional air force in the world. The bomber crews who had been so skeptical and frightened by Doolittle's order in January 1944 had completely reversed their assessment by June. They had noticed that German fighter attacks, which had been coordinated and deadly in the fall of 1943, had become increasingly infrequent and less effective as the spring progressed. They had noticed that their loss rates were declining even as the number and depth of missions increased, and they had noticed that the Pi-51 Mustangs that ranged ahead of their formations were destroying German fighters in numbers that seemed almost impossible to believe. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, the Memphis Belle pilot who had written so eloquently about the terror of flying over Germany in 1943, wrote a remarkable diary entry in May 1944 that captured the transformation that had occurred. "I owe General Doolittle an apology," Morgan wrote. "When I first heard about the new fighter tactics in January, I thought we were being sacrificed. I thought the fighters were abandoning us to be slaughtered by the Luftwaffe while they went off chasing glory. I was wrong. I was completely wrong. The fighters have destroyed the Luftwaffe by hunting them aggressively, rather than waiting for them to attack us. We fly deep into Germany now, deeper than we ever flew in 1943, and we barely see German fighters. When they do appear, there are so few of them that our gunners can handle them without needing the escorts to intervene. The escorts have done their job by going out and killing German fighters wherever they could find them. They protected us not by hovering over us but by destroying the enemy before the enemy could threaten us. It is brilliant, and I was too frightened and too focused on my own survival to see it. General Doolittle understood something that the rest of us did not. You protect bombers by killing the enemy's fighters, not by surrounding bombers with defensive escorts. I have completed my tour now. 25 missions. I am going home, and I am alive because General Doolittle changed the tactic. If the old doctrine had continued, I would probably be dead or a prisoner by now. I owe him my life, and so do thousands of other airmen who made it home because the Luftwaffe was destroyed before it could kill them. In the end, Jimmy Doolittle did not just change a sign on a wall in a headquarters building in England. He fundamentally altered the course of the air war over Europe and established a doctrine that would shape air combat for generations. He transformed a desperate strategic situation, where American bomber losses were threatening the viability of the entire daylight bombing campaign, into a decisive victory where Allied air forces operated over Germany with near impunity. He enabled the invasion of Europe by ensuring that Allied ground forces would have complete air superiority from the moment they landed on the beaches until the final surrender of German forces. And he proved that leadership in war is not about following established doctrine or accepting conventional wisdom, but about having the courage to recognize when doctrine is wrong and the moral strength to change it, even when doing so means gambling with thousands of lives. Wars are not won by commanders who play it safe. They are won by commanders who understand the strategic situation clearly, who recognize what tactics are necessary to achieve victory, and who have the courage to implement those tactics even when everyone around them says they are making a mistake. Doolittle was that kind of commander. The decision he made in January 1944 to erase one sign and replace it with another, to unleash American fighters and give them permission to hunt rather than defend, was a decision that changed history. The bombers came home not because fighters stayed close to them, but because fighters went out and systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe until there was no one left to fight. It was offensive warfare at its purest and most effective, and the Allied victory in Europe was built on the foundation that decision created. Change the sign, change the tactics, win the war. It sounds simple in retrospect, but in January 1944, with the outcome still uncertain, and with thousands of lives hanging in the balance, it took extraordinary courage to make that decision, and to stand by it when the pressure to revert to safe, conventional tactics was enormous. Jimmy Doolittle had that courage, and the skies over Europe were won because he did.